Hello everyone, I'm Jonathan, also known as the Medieval Genie, and today we're going to be talking about swinging using wrist actions predominantly. Now I'm going to use words like cut, but I'm talking really in reference to what I'm doing with this weapon here. So this is my falcata that I forged, more on that in a different video, and it's of course a sword in one hand. But these actions can be applied to two-handed weapons and to non-bladed weapons as well. So bear that in mind. But like I said, the item I'm going to use to demonstrate today is a sword in one hand. So firstly, for the contrast, when I'm talking about cuts on the wrist, it's a very particular motion where of course the action is happening almost entirely because of the power coming from the wrist. This is in contrast with full body cuts, so you'll notice in the cut that I'm about to do here, you should bear in mind I'm going to use my legs and my feet, I'm going to use my hips and my shoulders to bring forwards. I will also bring my arms around of course, and use my wrist to add extra power, and then it combines into one full body cut, and then all of this happens. It's a perfectly fine cut. But some people who are more new to martial arts, test cutting or whatever, might not realise to put proper wrist technique into it. So we're going to take a lot of that full body cut away and cut it right back to cutting powered almost entirely, or actually entirely, from the wrist. So instead of that cut I showed earlier, which is an ordinary cut diagonally across, it's a natural action from my dominant side, cutting diagonally across the body and then chop. Simple as that. Now let's look at the same cut powered from the wrist. So I'm going to start here on my shoulder. I could also start upright. I've done it with both. And then I just do that. Now if you've ever seen some of my test cutting videos, it doesn't matter if you have or not, but you'll see that this is still a functional cut. It is of course not as powerful and not as well structured as the full body cut, but it is still a very legitimate cut. And yet, I'm almost entirely using the wrist. Yes, I'm bringing my forearm across. This is to add a bit of structure. If I try to do more of that, it's a bit more uncomfortable. I don't really want to be injuring my hands and my arms doing this, but the actual force in the cut is almost entirely from the wrist. Let me show you from this angle. So I'm starting here. My arm's moving about that much, might straighten out a bit, but this, if you thought of this as a punch, this is a very weak action, yet when I add the wrist into it, it suddenly becomes, you can hear the whistle in the air possibly, it becomes a potentially quite powerful cut. And I'm not even cutting through, I'm fairly stopping. I could move it into some other action, so showing that again, that I can do a cut, whirl around and potentially look at defending myself or recovering afterwards, or even getting ready for some extra attacks. So with that, that's just from my dominant side cutting diagonally down. It can also be done upwards. So if I start, I'm going to prefer upright this time, and then I'm just, instead of moving my wrist forwards like this, and you'll notice, I should mention in the structure, of course there's this motion in the literal wrist, but there is also a degree that I can open and close my hands. I'm not necessarily going to let go of the sword, of course I don't want to be disarming myself like a fool, but you don't have to have a death grip. As long as you've got a reasonable firm grip on the weapon, you're not going to lose it. It's not like in TV and movies, which are crap, where someone hits your weapon and then suddenly it just flies away. I've looked at things in sparring and that rarely happens, and even so it's because already there's been injury done to the hand and they can barely grip the weapon anymore. So with that, you can loosen the grip a bit and then tighten the grip, and just by that slight opening and closing of the hand. So I'm keeping my thumb and my index finger on the sword, and I've still got plenty of control over it unless someone purposefully wrenches it out of my grip. And yet by closing the hand with the other fingers, the middle finger, ring finger and index finger, little finger rather, that adds a bit of power to the cut as well, on top of the actual rotation in the wrist. So you combine that all together and then you've got that power. Now back to cutting from below, I'm going to start upright, and then I'm doing a similar rotation, except rather than going from up downwards, I'm going to curl around and then move the wrist in a circular motion. You'll see what I'm doing here. Let me show you from a side angle. Now you'll notice when I'm doing sort of the more dexterous stuff, I even almost completely open my hand, and I'm doing a lot of this. And a lot of this that I'm doing, admittedly it's a bad habit of mine that I do in my videos a lot, or more of this kind of stuff. Nearly all the power again is coming from the wrist. So with that motion again, and just with a circular motion that way or that way in the case that we're doing now, powers the cut. So start upright, I wish to cut diagonally upwards, say towards the face, so I just go. And again, although you're seeing my body and my arm move, this is more just to do a structure, just allow it to be more comfortable and not kind of awkward and painful, because of course I don't want to be bringing my wrist too far and injuring myself. Really, I should be bringing it so the blades pretty much going straight forward in a line, so you can see from my shoulders it's going in a line to the blade. If I try to push it any further, I'm going to cause myself injury. So I'm just simply adapting my arm so I can cut through without having to hurt myself. But like I said, the actual power in the cut is pretty much entirely from the wrist and the hand. Now if we look at doing so perhaps from the non-dominant side, I might start something like this. So the sword is in what in military saber might be called a hanging guard. And then I can go, this time I will cut diagonally downwards from my non-dominant side. So I go. And I can also recover. So you'll notice there, if I do the cut and the recovery, I can add some wrist movements and even just sort of let the sword flow. This is just like a full body cut. Rather than stopping yourself and kind of coming to a halt, if you let it flow around, you've got a more fluid style. I'm only restricting and stopping to sort of show the structure, but in a more realistic and more true kind of sword fighting, it would be more like I'm doing that. You know, I'm either doing the cut and doing some kind of recovery, or even I'm doing the action, letting it flow around with the help of the wrist again, so wrist recovery, next action. So cut from the wrist, cut from the wrist. And you can start cut from the wrist, cut from the wrist. The only thing you really need to worry about is one, make sure you don't, like I said, over bend the wrist and hurt yourself. Just let your arm help you, you know, have the correct angle of the cut, just to help make sure that you don't get hurt, basically. And additionally, just try not to get into any habit of not aligning the edge properly. It's okay after you've gone through the cut, and then it doesn't matter where the edge alignment is until your next cut. Don't worry about the edge alignment. So there's that, what's the word, interim between cuts, where it's okay, obviously, it doesn't matter where the blade is aligned. But if you want to practice wrist cuts properly, during the cut, try your best to make sure that the edge is actually on line. Again, test cutting with targets will help with this. So if you have something like a bit of old fruit, plastic bottle, old juice cartons, things like that, tatami mats even, better to have tatami mats, then you can just try to check and just make sure that if you've got a decent straight bladed sharp blade, that just helps with the alignment. Of course, if your preferred weapon is not a blade, then don't worry about it at all. Even easier. That's why sometimes things like maces can be such lovely weapons, because if you hit at a slightly off angle, doesn't matter, you're still smashing things apart, whereas with a sword, flat slaps are embarrassing. So we go again. So I cut, whether it's from upright or from my shoulder, I cut 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1. Go a bit further back so you can see a bit more of the structure. I'm doing a little bit more horizontally on this side just because there's a sofa and I don't want to cut it to ribbons. But if I move a bit further away, it can be more vertical or it can be more horizontal. Now, apart from that, in terms of structuring cuts from the wrist, if you then learn to combine that with a full body action, try to see, you should be able to feel it and you can almost focus on it specifically. It's a very tactile thing. Rather than looking at a cut and seeing if you're cutting through, this is without the wrist, you should be able to feel that with the wrist it adds a bit of speed that I tend to notice. So if you're cutting here's without the wrist, and then here's with the wrist, you'll even hear the pitch of that whistle has gotten slightly higher. It's because it's cutting a little bit faster and it's whistling through the air more. But you can see it affecting targets more, so there's more force, and in general will do more damage. Try again not to have too tight a grip while you're doing this. You'll notice if you're up against, say, a training pel, which is an inanimate target that doesn't get destroyed, just something to practice technique against, or if you're up against an actual cutting target like a tatami mat, if you grip too tightly, or in a sparring session with an actual live partner, if you've got too much of a tight grip while doing these types of cuts, or any cuts, eventually your palms will get really achy and the back of your hand will get really achy, your wrist and your forearm, basically all of this area will really start to hurt, and that will tell you that you're having a bit of a death grip and you're kind of squeezing so tight that it's actually injuring yourself. Whereas if you just relax, again, you don't need a death grip because it won't disarm you unless you're really getting weak and tired, in which case a death grip won't help anyway, then you should be able to continue these cuts. I mean, to be honest, it's a bit hot in this room despite how cold it is outside, and during this video my hands have been sweating. And the grip on this sword that I've made has varnish on it, so it's very smooth and should be slick, but you'll notice it's not trying to come free or anything. Even as my voice and my lungs give out because I've got terrible lungs, despite the fairly relaxed grip, it's not trying to slip out still. So that should hopefully give some confidence that actually you don't need to grip too tightly when trying to do these cuts from the wrist or more full body actions, really. So yeah, I hope that was helpful. I'll talk more about cutting structure and general techniques with swords and maybe some other weapons in the future, but I hope that was useful and I shall see you in the next video. Until then, practice!